"Get off my land." The words hit Martin Hawkins like a fist to the chest. He stood in the middle of the field he had plowed, seeded, and harvested with his own 2 hands for the past 4 years, the Wyoming sun blazing down on his neck, and he stared at the woman standing on the porch of the ranch house as if she had just announced the earth was flat and the sky was green. She was holding a piece of paper, a legal document from the look of it. Her chin was lifted at an angle that suggested she had practiced this moment, rehearsed the exact tilt of authority she would need to project when she arrived. She wore a traveling dress of deep navy blue, road-dusted and wrinkled from what must have been a very long journey, and her dark hair was pinned up in a way that was coming undone at the temples from the heat and the wind. She was not what Martin had expected when he had heard someone was coming to deal with the estate of old Gerald Collins. He had expected a lawyer, or maybe a brother, or maybe nobody at all. He had not expected her. "I beg your pardon," Martin said, keeping his voice level, though everything inside him was anything but. "You heard me," she said, and her voice carried across the yard with a clarity that told him she was not bluffing, not performing, not uncertain. "I am Mabel Collins. Gerald Collins was my uncle. This ranch belonged to him, and by the terms of his will, it now belongs to me. I have the deed. I have the attorney's letter, and I have every legal right to ask you to vacate this property." Martin looked down at his hands, at the calluses on his palms, at the dirt under his fingernails that came from 4 years of labor in the earth of this land. He looked at the fields behind him, green and golden, heavy with the promise of a wheat crop that was 3 weeks from harvest. He had planted every seed of it. He had fixed every broken fence post along the eastern boundary. He had rebuilt the barn roof after the spring storm 2 years ago nearly took the whole thing off. He had poured himself into this land as if it were a living thing that needed him as much as he needed it. And now, a woman he had never seen before in his life was standing on the porch of a house he had maintained with his own hands and telling him to get out. He removed his hat. He pressed it against his chest. He took a slow breath that he hoped did not reveal the depth of the rage and the grief and the fear that was climbing up through him like something wild. "Miss Collins," he said, very carefully, "I think we need to talk." She did not soften, but she did not turn away either. And in that moment, in the hot and brutal silence of a Wyoming noon in the summer of 1882, with the grasshoppers singing in the tall grass and the wind pushing dust devils across the yard, neither of them could have known that the conversation she was about to allow was going to change both of their lives in ways that neither of them was prepared for. Mabel Collins had arrived in Casper on the morning train from Chicago. She had not slept properly in 4 days. The journey from Chicago to Casper in the summer of 1882 was not a gentle one. The Chicago and Northwestern Railway took her as far as it could, and then came the stagecoach connections, the long dusty miles through territory that felt increasingly remote and increasingly indifferent to human comfort. She had watched the landscape change outside the coach window with a mixture of awe and deep unease. The flat Midwestern farmlands gave way to rolling hills. The hills gave way to something vast and spare and unforgiving, and the sky grew bigger than she had ever imagined a sky could be. She had grown up in Chicago, the daughter of Gerald Collins's younger sister, and Chicago was a city of streets and noise, and the smell of the stockyards on a south wind and the constant press of people. This was nothing like Chicago. She had the deed to the Clearwater Ranch in her traveling bag, tucked inside a leather folder, alongside the attorney's letter from a man named Emmett Hartley in Casper, who had handled her uncle's estate. The letter explained that Gerald Collins had died in March of 1882 of a fever that had taken him in under a week, that he had left no wife and no children, that his nearest living relative was his sister's daughter in Chicago, and that the ranch and all its assets and liabilities were now hers by inheritance. Mabel had read that letter 6 times on the train. Each reading had produced a different emotion. The first reading produced shock. The second produced grief, though she had only met Gerald Collins twice in her life, both times when she was very young, and her memory of him was vague and large and bearded, and somehow kind in a way that she could not fully articulate. The third reading produced calculation, because Mabel Collins was nothing if not practical. The fourth reading produced something close to anger at the timing of it, because she was 26 years old and she had a life in Chicago, such as it was, and inheriting a cattle ranch in Wyoming was not something she had planned for. The fifth reading produced resolve, and the sixth produced the quiet, bone-deep determination that had carried her all the way from the Illinois Central platform to this dusty yard in the middle of nowhere. She was going to sell the ranch. That had been the plan from the moment she boarded the first train. The attorney's letter had suggested the property was worth a considerable sum, that the land was good grazing land with reliable water from Clearwater Creek, that the ranch house was solid, and the outbuildings were in decent repair, that there was a tenant farmer currently working the property under an informal arrangement with her late uncle. She would come, she would assess the property, she would engage a buyer, and she would return to Chicago with enough money to pay off the debts her mother had left behind when she died 2 years ago, and perhaps enough left over to do something with herself, though what that something might be, she had not yet decided. The tenant farmer was not supposed to be a complication. The attorney's letter had described the arrangement in vague terms, suggesting only that the man had been working a portion of the property under a verbal agreement with Gerald, and that the matter of his tenancy would need to be resolved. Mabel had resolved in her mind that it would be resolved quickly and without drama. She would offer him a reasonable period to vacate. She would be fair. She was always fair. And then she would sell the land and go home. She had not anticipated the fields. When the hired buckboard from Casper had brought her down the long dirt road toward the ranch house that morning, she had seen the fields from a mile away. They stretched out on the western side of the property in long, orderly rows, and even she, who had never farmed anything in her life, could see that they were spectacular. Whatever was growing in those fields was tall and healthy and shimmering in the morning light, and the fields were surrounded by the most meticulous fencing she had ever seen, every post straight and true, every wire strung taut. And then she had seen the man. He was working near the far end of the field, too far away for her to make out his features, but she could see the shape of him clearly enough, lean and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy efficiency of someone who knew every inch of the ground beneath his feet. He had paused and looked toward the buckboard, and even from that distance she had felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. She had not wavered. She had told the driver to take her to the house, and she had gone inside and she had looked at the rooms that were her uncle's and tried to understand that she owned them now, and then she had come back out onto the porch with the deed in her hand and waited for the man to come to her. The meeting had not gone the way she planned. She had expected him to be defensive. She had expected him to argue about the arrangement he had with her uncle, to appeal to sentiment or custom. What she had not expected was the stillness in him when she told him to get off her land. Not the stillness of submission, but the stillness of something very carefully controlled. He had looked at her with eyes that were the color of the sky just before a storm, a deep and complicated gray, and she had felt, to her extreme annoyance, something shift slightly in her chest. "Miss Collins," he said again now from the yard, his hat pressed to his chest, "I think we need to talk." She could not simply refuse him that. That would not be fair, and Mabel Collins was always fair. "All right," she said. "Come inside." He came up the porch steps with the kind of unhurried confidence that she suspected he had been born with. He was taller than she had realized from a distance, and when he stepped into the shade of the porch, she could see his face clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, 31, the skin weathered but not yet aged, his jaw carrying several days of dark beard that was neither unkempt nor groomed. He smelled of the earth and of work and of something faintly like cedar from his shirt, and when he entered the house behind her, she noticed that he removed his boots at the door without being asked. She sat at the kitchen table. He sat across from her. Between them was the surface of a table that he had probably eaten at 100 times and she had eaten at never, and that asymmetry felt suddenly significant. "Your name is Martin Hawkins," she said. It was not a question. The attorney had given her his name. "Yes," he said. "You've been farming this land for how long?" "4 years," he said. "Going on 5 in November." "Under what terms?" He met her eyes. There was no evasion in him which she had not expected. "Your uncle and I had a spoken agreement. No money changed hands between us, which I know looks bad to someone who doesn't know the circumstances. Gerald gave me use of the western fields and the use of the barn and the south pasture in exchange for my keeping up the property. The maintenance, the fencing, the roof work. I kept records." "What kind of records?" He stood without asking permission, went to a cabinet in the corner of the kitchen, and returned with a journal. It was thick and worn at the edges, the cover darkened with handling. He set it in front of her. She opened it and looked at the pages inside. It was meticulous. Every repair noted, dated, and described in a hand that was clear and careful. Every piece of lumber purchased, every load of shingles, every hour of labor. The dates went back to the fall of 1878. She turned the pages slowly. She could feel him watching her and she did not look up. "You did all of this," she said. "Yes." "The barn roof. Spring storm of 1880 took the north half off. I replaced it myself with 2 weeks of work and help from a neighbor named Ed Pryor. The fencing along the eastern boundary. The original posts were rotted through. I pulled every one and set new cedar posts. That took most of a summer." She closed the journal. She sat with it under her hands and looked at the man across the table and tried to hold on to the simplicity of the plan she had arrived with. Sell the ranch. Go home to Chicago, pay off the debts, start over. "I'm sorry about your situation," she said, and she meant it. "But that doesn't change the legal reality. This land belongs to me. I have no obligation under the law to honor a verbal agreement made with someone who is no longer living." Something moved behind his eyes. It was not anger, exactly, though anger was somewhere inside it. It was something closer to what she imagined a man's face looked like when he heard a sentence he had been quietly dreading for a long time. "I know that," he said. "Then you understand what I'm saying." "I understand what you're saying," he said. "But I'd like to ask you something, and I'd ask you to hear me out before you answer." She nodded once. "That wheat crop in the western field," he said. "It's 3 weeks from harvest, maybe 22 days. If you pull me off this land right now, before that crop comes in, it'll go to waste. It can't be harvested by anyone who doesn't know the field, and you'd have to hire a full crew from Casper to do it if I leave, and that would cost you more than the crop is worth." He paused. "Give me 22 days to bring in the harvest. I'll split the proceeds with you, 60-40 in your favor, which is more than fair for land use, and I'll use that time to make other arrangements." Mabel looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet around them. From somewhere outside came the sound of a horse moving in the corral, the creak of the windmill over the well. "And after the 22 days, his jaw tightened slightly. "I leave. You sell the land. We go our separate ways." It was a reasonable proposal. It was logical and fair, and it solved a practical problem. She was not yet committed to selling immediately in any case. She still needed to meet with the attorney and assess the property's market value and receive offers. 22 days would give her time to do all of that. "Fine," she said. 22 days. He nodded and started to rise. "Mr. Hawkins," she said. He stopped. "I'm staying in the house," she said. "I understand that may be awkward, but it's my house." There was a flicker of something in his expression that might, on a different face, in a different context, have been amusement. "It's a big house, Miss Collins. I'll stay in the foreman's quarters off the barn. I've been sleeping there most nights anyway. Your uncle kept the main bedroom for when he was out visiting, which wasn't often after his health turned." "All right," she said. He left. She listened to his boots cross the porch and descend the steps, and then she sat at her uncle's kitchen table with his maintenance journal under her hands, and looked at the window and the square of Wyoming sky framed within it, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel how very far from home she was. The first 3 days were a careful, formal dance. Mabel spent them methodically going through the house, cataloging everything, making notes in a small leather-bound book she had brought from Chicago for exactly this purpose. The furniture, the tools, the livestock, which consisted of 4 horses, 7 cattle, and a prodigious number of chickens that seemed to belong to no one in particular and went where they pleased. She found her uncle's papers in a cedar chest in the back bedroom, neatly organized, and she spent an evening going through them by lamplight, learning things about Gerald Collins that she had never known in life. He had been a complicated man, not a rich one, despite owning valuable land. He had taken out loans against the property twice, once for a harsh winter that had killed most of his cattle in 1876, and once for a medical situation in 1879 that the papers did not specify clearly, and both loans had been paid back, she found, in large part through the labor and productivity of Martin Hawkins. The crops from those western fields had carried the ranch through years that might otherwise have broken it. She found a letter from Gerald to someone unnamed, never sent, folded and tucked inside the back cover of a Bible. It was dated 2 months before his death. In it, Gerald wrote that he wished things had gone differently, that he had been meaning to put something proper in writing for Martin for years, and had kept putting it off the way a man puts off all the things that feel most important and most permanent. He wrote that Martin was the best kind of man, the kind who gave more than he took and never asked to be recognized for it, and that he hoped whoever came after him would see that clearly. Mabel sat with that letter for a long time. She was not a woman who was easily moved. She had grown up in circumstances that had required her to be practical above all else. Her father had left when she was 9, just walked out one morning and did not come back, and her mother had worked as a seamstress and taken in laundry, and held the small Collins household together with a ferocious, quiet dignity that Mabel had absorbed as completely as she had absorbed the sound of the sewing machine, and the smell of starch, and the particular loneliness of being a child in a household where there was never quite enough. She had learned young that sentiment was a luxury, and that clear-eyed practicality was survival, and she had carried that lesson into her adulthood with a conviction that occasionally made her seem harder than she was. But Gerald's letter made something ache in her. She folded it carefully and put it back exactly as she had found it. On the 4th morning she walked out to the fields. Martin was already there when she arrived, moving along one of the rows with a practiced eye, checking the heads of wheat, testing the stalks with his fingers. He did not appear startled to see her. He straightened and waited as she picked her way carefully between the rows in boots that were entirely wrong for a wheat field. "How does it look?" she asked, because it was the natural question and because she genuinely wanted to know. "Good," he said. He was not a man who padded his answers with excess words. 18 to 20 days now. Weather holds, we'll have a strong yield." She looked at the field around her. The wheat came up to her ribs in places, the heads heavy and golden-tipped. The morning light came across it at a low angle and turned everything luminous. "Have you always farmed?" she asked. "No," he said. He paused, and she thought he might leave it at that. Then he said, "I was a cattle driver before this. 7 years on the trail, up from Texas through Kansas and into Wyoming territory." "Did the Kishom route 4 times?" She looked at him with a reassessment she tried to keep from showing on her face. "What made you stop?" "The trail changed," he said simply. "The railroads moved, the routes got crowded, and I was tired." He looked out over the field. "I was very tired." She understood something in that. The bone-deep weariness of a life that demands everything. The moment when you need to stop moving and put your hands into something that stays. "My uncle gave you that," she said quietly. He looked at her then directly with those storm-gray eyes. "Yes." They stood in the wheat field without speaking for a moment, and the wind moved through the crop around them with a sound like breathing. "I read his maintenance journal last night," she said. "All of it." He did not respond, but something in his posture changed subtly. He was right to trust you, she said. It cost her something to say it, though she could not have explained exactly what. I can see that from the records. He was a good man, Martin said. His voice was level, but she heard something underneath it that was not level at all. I'm sorry he didn't put it in writing, she said. The arrangement, I'm sorry for the position that puts you in. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm not your enemy, Miss Collins. I know that, she said. And I'm not asking for charity. I made an agreement and I'll honor it. 22 days, the harvest, and then I'll go. She nodded. She turned to leave the field. She was almost at the edge of it when he called her name. She turned. Your boots, he said. You'll want different ones for out here. There's a dry goods store in Redfield 6 miles east. They'll have something more practical. She looked down at her boots, which were already darkened with soil and completely unsuited to this terrain. She looked back up at him. Thank you, she said. She walked back to the house and did not look back. Though she was aware of his presence behind her in the field, the way you are aware of a fire in a room you have just left. The trip to Redfield happened on the 5th day, and it was the trip that began to crack the wall between them, though neither of them would have described it in those terms at the time. Martin drove the buckboard. There was no reason for him to do so except that the team was his to handle and she did not know the road. They sat side by side on the buckboard seat with a careful foot of space between them, and for the first several miles they did not speak at all, which was not uncomfortable exactly, but was very deliberate. Redfield was a small town, the kind of Wyoming town that existed because the land around it demanded servicing, not because anyone had planned it. It had a dry goods store, a hardware establishment, a saloon, a telegraph office, a small hotel that doubled as a boarding house, a church that was also used for town meetings, and a scattering of houses arranged with no particular intention along 2 unpaved streets. The dry goods store was run by a woman named Clara Finch, who was perhaps 50 and had the particular competence of someone who had been essential to a community for a long time and knew it. Clara Finch looked at Mabel Collins with the frank assessment of a woman in a small town sizing up a stranger, and then she looked at Martin Hawkins beside her, and something in her expression became interested in a way that was not subtle. So you're Gerald's niece, Clara said. I am, Mabel said. We were all sorry to hear about Gerald. He was a fixture out here, stubborn as a mule and kind as Sunday when he wanted to be. Clara studied Mabel. You look like him around the eyes. Mabel was not sure how to receive this, but she said thank you. She bought 2 pairs of proper working boots, a pair of thick canvas trousers, 3 practical work shirts, and a wide-brimmed hat that Clara assured her was non-negotiable for Wyoming summers. She also bought a pair of leather work gloves, not because she planned to be doing any farm labor, but because her hands were already chapping from the dry air. While she was paying, Martin wandered to the hardware section and came back with a coil of wire fence and 2 boxes of staples. He paid for these himself. When she raised an eyebrow at the fence wire, he said, There's a section on the north boundary that needs attention before winter. I want to leave the property in good condition. She was quiet on the ride back for the first few miles, thinking about that. He was repairing fencing on land he was about to leave, not for himself, for whoever came after. Why do you do that? She asked. Do what? Care for things that aren't yours anymore. He thought about it for a moment. The buckboard creaked and the horses moved at an easy pace and the afternoon light was long and golden across the grass. Because the land doesn't know who owns it, he said. It just knows whether it's being taken care of. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the road ahead, his profile clean against the sky. That's an unusual way to think about it, she said. Maybe, he said. But I've seen what land looks like when nobody tends it. It goes to bitterness, same as people. She sat with that for the rest of the ride. That night, she did not eat alone as she had the previous 4 evenings. Martin had taken the habit of cooking for himself in the foreman's quarters, and she had been managing with what was in the pantry, which was not extensive. But when she came into the kitchen that evening, she found that someone had left a pot of beans simmering on the stove and a plate of cornbread on the table, and a note in the careful handwriting from the maintenance journal that said simply, "I made extra." She sat down at the table and ate the best meal she had eaten since leaving Chicago, and she looked at the wall across from her and thought about a man who repaired fences he would never use and cooked food for people he had no reason to be generous to, and she wondered what his story was. Not the facts of it, which she was beginning to piece together, but the hidden parts. The dark past, whatever it was. Because a man didn't leave the cattle trail and give his whole self to a plot of land without a reason he didn't talk about. She asked him about it on the 7th day. They had developed by then a loose daily rhythm, the way two people who are sharing a space will inevitably develop, not through intention but through the simple physics of proximity and necessity. He worked the fields from first light. She walked the property in the mornings, continuing her assessment. They crossed paths at midday and occasionally in the evening, and the conversations had been growing gradually, incrementally less formal in the way that conversations do when the people having them have begun to recognize each other as fully human rather than as categories. She found him at the creek that afternoon, the one that gave the ranch its name, Clearwater Creek, which ran along the southern edge of the property in a clear, quick current over smooth stones. He was sitting on the bank with his boots off and his feet in the water, which she had not expected, and for a moment the surprise of it made her stop. He looked up. "Miss Collins, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." "You're not intruding," he said. "It's your creek." She sat on the bank a few feet from him and looked at the water. It was a beautiful afternoon, the kind of afternoon that seemed designed to make you doubt any urgency you had been feeling about anything. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You can ask," he said. "Why Clearwater? You were on the cattle trail for 7 years, which means you had opportunities to go elsewhere, buy into something, build something. Why did you stop here specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass behind them. "I was in a bad way when I came here," he said finally. "Not in the physical sense. I wasn't sick or broke, though I've been both at various points. I was in a bad way in here." He touched his chest briefly. "The trail does things to you after a while. You've seen things. Not just the ordinary hard things, but the things that eat at you. The injustice of it. You're driving cattle for men who own everything, and the men doing the driving own nothing. And along the way you see what's happened to the people who were here before, the Arapaho, the Shoshone, their land taken from them by every legal and illegal means available, and you're part of that machinery whether you want to be or not, just by being there, by being part of the system that pushes west. I couldn't make it right, but I could decide what to do with myself." He paused. She did not speak. She was very still. "I came through here in the fall of 1878, just passing through, and I stopped to water the horses at this creek. Gerald was coming back from Redfield on the road, and he saw me, and he invited me in for supper the way people did out here, because that's how people lived out here, and we talked for 4 hours at that kitchen table. He was trying to hold this place together with his own 2 aging hands after his hired man left, and I was trying to figure out where I was going next. He picked up a stone from the bank and turned it in his fingers. He offered me the arrangement. I thought I'd stay a season. See how it felt to be in one place. And," she said softly, "and it felt like the first right thing in a very long time," he said. She looked at his profile against the afternoon light. The sadness in him was not sharp. It was old, settled, the kind of sadness that has been made peace with without being resolved. "What things did you see?" she asked. "On the trail, the things that ate at you." He was quiet for a long time. The water moved over the stones. "I watched a Cheyenne family burned out of a camp in 1874, he said. "We were riding through, and the army unit doing it told us to keep moving, and we kept moving because that's what you did. You kept moving. You didn't have power and you didn't have standing, and you told yourself you couldn't have stopped it. And you're right that you couldn't have stopped it, but you could have refused to witness it in silence. You could have said something, written something, done something." He paused. "I didn't. I kept moving, and I've carried that." Mabel looked at the water. "You were one man," she said quietly. "Yes," he said, "that's what I tell myself." They sat by the creek for another hour, and they talked about other things, lighter things, and the afternoon moved slowly around them, and the light changed on the water, and neither of them commented on how long they had been sitting there, because to comment on it would have been to break something that neither of them wanted broken. By the 10th day, something had shifted that could not be described as simply practical anymore. It was not any single moment. It was an accumulation of moments, the kind of accumulation that happens when two people are placed in close proximity by circumstances and are forced to actually see each other. She had seen him carry a calf that had gotten its leg caught in loose fencing, gentle and sure-handed, talking softly to the animal the whole time. He had seen her spend an evening helping one of the neighboring women, a Mrs. Trudy Pryor who had come by to introduce herself, by writing a letter on her behalf to a government land office about a boundary dispute, because Mabel had learned when she was young that the ability to write clearly was power, and she had always used it for people who needed it. He had seen her cry once, very briefly, at the kitchen table when she found a box of her uncle's personal effects that included a photograph of his sister, her mother, taken when they were young, and looking at each other with the absolute uncomplicated love of siblings before life has complicated them. She had not known he saw her. But he had been passing the kitchen window and he had seen, and the next morning there was fresh coffee made and a wildflower left on the table in a jam jar, a small yellow thing that grew along the creek bank, and no note, just the flower. She had put the flower in the window where the light could reach it and not spoken of it. On the 12th day, he asked her about Chicago. They were eating together at the kitchen table, which had become the routine now, taking turns cooking or more often cooking together in the easy way that develops between two people when one of them knows how a kitchen works and the other is willing to be directed. He had asked what she did in Chicago, and she had told him that she worked in a dry goods accounting office, keeping the books, which she was good at, and that before that she had worked in a millinery shop, and before that she had been a schoolteacher for 2 years in a small school in a poor neighborhood which she had loved but which had not paid enough to manage the debts her mother left. "You left teaching because of money," he said. "Yes." "Do you miss it?" She thought about it honestly. "Every day," she said. There's something about a child who suddenly understands something they didn't understand before, something that comes alive in their face. I've never seen anything else quite like it. He looked at her in a way that was different from the looking he had been doing since she arrived, and she felt it differently than she had felt his looking before. "What would you do," he said slowly, "if money weren't the deciding factor?" "I'd go back to teaching," she said immediately, and then was surprised by her own immediacy. She set down her fork. That was a fast answer. "Fast answers are usually the true ones," he said. She looked at him across the table, and something in the air between them felt suddenly like the moment before a door opens, full of potential and of the slight terror of potential. "Don't," she said quietly. He looked at her steadily. "I haven't said anything. You were about to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're right, I was." She picked up her fork again. Her heart was doing something she did not have a word for. "We made an agreement," she said. 22 days. "Yes," he said. "And you've kept it," she said. "You've been nothing but honorable." "I've tried to be," he said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Mr. Hawkins." He said nothing more. But when she looked up a moment later, he was not looking at his plate. He was looking at her. And the look was not hidden, it was not disguised, it was not dressed up as something else. It was simply what it was. She looked back at him for 3 full seconds, which was longer than was safe, and then she looked at her plate and concentrated on her meal with an intensity that had nothing to do with the food. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in her uncle's bed under the window and watched the stars through the glass and thought about the man sleeping in the foreman's quarters 40 feet away and told herself 17 sensible things. She had a life in Chicago. She had plans. She had debts to settle and a future to build. And that future had been assembled brick by brick out of necessity. And it was not the future she would have chosen, but it was hers, and it was solid. She did not know this man. She had known him for 12 days. 12 days was nothing. 12 days was a photograph of a person, not the person themselves. People had hidden motives, dark pasts they had not fully disclosed, secrets they were waiting to reveal. She had seen enough of how that went. Her father had seemed like a good man too. She told herself all 17 sensible things and then lay awake for another 2 hours looking at the Wyoming stars. The trouble came on the 14th day, and it came in the form of a man named Douglas Vane. Vane arrived mid-morning on a brown horse with a brand she did not recognize, dressed in the particular kind of well-tailored clothing that suggests money worn in places where money is not common. He was perhaps 45, clean-shaved, with a salesman's smile that went wider than his eyes. Martin was in the far field when Vane arrived, and Mabel received him on the porch alone. Vane introduced himself as a land buyer operating on behalf of a ranching consortium based out of Denver. He had heard through the attorney Emmett Hartley that the Clearwater Ranch had come onto the market. He had ridden out to make a preliminary offer. Mabel invited him to the porch table. She listened to his offer. It was a reasonable number, not spectacular but fair by the standards she had been researching. She told him she was still assessing the property and would be entertaining offers for another week or two. He said he understood. He said the consortium was serious and could move quickly. He handed her a card. Then he looked out at the fields with the wheat in them, and his smile did something that she noticed but did not immediately categorize. "Beautiful crop," he said. "Who's been working the land?" "There is a tenant farmer," she said carefully. "Hawkins." Vane said she was surprised. "You know him." "Knew of him," Vane said with a particular emphasis. "He was on the Kisham route for years. Did you know he was involved in a dispute up near the Colorado line about 3 years before he came here? A trail boss named Kavanaugh. There was a fight. A man was badly hurt." Mabel held very still. "What are you implying, Mr. Vane?" "I'm not implying anything," Vane said, still smiling. "Just noting that a man's history is worth understanding before you trust him too far, especially when you're a woman alone on a remote property." He said it with the smooth concern of someone who means the opposite. She recognized it instantly for what it was because she had heard it before, in Chicago, from men who used concern as a crowbar. "I appreciate your interest, Mr. Vane," she said. "I'll be in touch through Mr. Hartley." She stood. He took the dismissal with good grace that didn't quite reach his eyes, touched his hat, and rode back toward the road. She went to find Martin. She found him at the north boundary on his knees in the grass, working on the fencing with the wire she had watched him buy in Redfield. He looked up when he heard her coming. He could read something in her face immediately. She could tell by the way he stood. She told him about Vane. She told him all of it, including what Vane had said about the dispute near the Colorado line. He went very still in the way she had learned to read, not as blankness but as processing. Then he sat down on one of the fence posts he had just driven and was quiet for a long moment. "The man near the Colorado line," she said gently. "What happened?" "His name was Kavanaugh," Martin said. "He was a trail boss known for running his men into the ground and then refusing to pay them at the end of the drive. I'd heard about it before I hired on with him, but I needed the work. When we got to Cheyenne and he tried to cut the payment by half with some invented excuse about a cattle count discrepancy, I wasn't the only one who objected. But I was the loudest. His jaw was tight." The fight Vane is referring to was Kavanaugh throwing the first punch. "The man who was badly hurt was one of Kavanaugh's hired hands who jumped me from behind. I defended myself. There were witnesses. No charges were brought because there was nothing to bring them on." He looked at her directly. "But Kavanaugh had money and connections, and the story that traveled was the one he told." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Gerald's letter in the Bible, the best kind of man. "The kind who gives more than he takes." "I believe you," she said. He blinked, just once, a small thing, but she saw it, saw what it meant to him to hear those 3 words. "Vane's offer," he said, pulling himself back to practicality. "Was it reasonable?" "Yes," she said, "but I don't like him." "Liking him isn't necessary," he said carefully, "if the number is right and the deed transfers cleanly." She looked at him. There was something terribly generous about him saying that, about him making it easier for her to do the thing that would end his time here. She felt something turn over in her chest like a stone rolled from a dark place into light. "I know that," she said, "but his consortium buys land and then runs operations on scale. Large cattle drives. He'll put a crew on this land and they'll push the small farms and the small ranchers on the surrounding properties out within 5 years. I've seen what that kind of consolidation does. I've read about it. I've done the accounts for it." She paused. "I'm not sure I want to be responsible for that." Martin looked at her carefully. "That's a different consideration than you came here with." "Yes," she said, "it is." They walked back toward the house together, and the afternoon lengthened around them, and something between them had changed again. The way weather changes, the way light changes, continuously and without stopping. On the 15th day, Mabel Collins did something that surprised her more than anyone else. She went into the field and helped. She could not have articulated entirely why. She told herself it was because she wanted to understand what she was selling. That was partly true. She told herself it was because the days were long and she had finished her catalog of the property, and there was very little else to do until she heard back from Emmett Hartley about the status of the outstanding loans she had discovered needed to be settled before any sale. That was also partly true. The real truth was something she was not quite ready to examine directly. Martin looked up when she came into the field in her new boots and her canvas trousers and her wide-brimmed hat, and he looked at her for a moment, and then handed her a pair of work gloves without comment. He showed her what to look for in the wheat heads, how to test the moisture content by rubbing the grains between her fingers, what color told you about ripeness, how to spot the early signs of rust or blight. He was an excellent teacher, patient and precise, explaining each thing once and clearly, and then letting her practice it without hovering. She thought about what she had told him, that she had loved teaching because of the moment when understanding arrived on a child's face. She thought she understood now something about what it felt like to be on the other side of that moment. They worked together through the morning and into the afternoon, and the conversation moved between them as easy as the creek water, touching on things that mattered and things that didn't, her memories of her mother and his memories of learning to ride, the books she had read and his opinions on the ones he had read, of which there were more than she had initially assumed, because he had carried books on the trail, and before that he had had a mother who believed that reading was not optional. "Tell me about her," Mabel said. They were eating their noon meal in the shade at the field's edge, their backs against the fence, the wheat moving in the light breeze in front of them. "She was from Virginia," he said. "She came west with my father in 1848. He was looking for gold like everyone else, and he found none like everyone else, but she had already made up her mind to love the West by then, and there was no going back. She died when I was 16 of a fever, quick like your uncle." He paused. "She was the most competent person I've ever known. She could do anything. Build a shelf, birth a calf, argue theology with a minister, sew a dress from scratch. She never seemed to need anything from anyone." "That sounds lonely," Mabel said quietly. He turned to look at her. "It does, doesn't it?" he said, as if hearing it that way for the first time. "Independent people get lonely in a particular way," she said, "because they're very good at not letting it show." He held her gaze. The afternoon wind moved his hair across his forehead. "You're describing yourself," he said softly. She looked away at the wheat field, at the shimmering horizon beyond it. "Maybe I am," she said. The 17th day brought rain. Not a gentle rain, a Wyoming summer storm that came up in the afternoon with the speed that weather had in this open country, where you could see it from 50 miles away, and it still arrived before you were ready. The sky went from blue to green to gray in the space of an hour, and then the rain came down hard and sudden, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in under an hour. Martin was out in the field securing everything that could be secured when the storm hit hard, and Mabel was at the house, and she stood on the porch watching the rain come down in sheets and watching the lightning crack over the hills to the north, and she was not afraid of the storm exactly, but she was afraid of something she didn't have a name for, which was worse. He came back to the house soaked through. She met him at the door with a towel, and he took it with an expression of mild surprise, as if he had not expected to be met, and she stepped back to let him in out of the rain. He stood in the kitchen and dried off, and she poured coffee from the pot that had been on all afternoon and set it in front of him, and they sat at the kitchen table while the rain hammered the roof and the windows and the world outside turned dark and close and intimate the way the world does during a storm. "Will the crop be all right?" she asked. "It can handle this," he said. "It's close enough to harvest that the grain is set. It'll be fine as long as the storm doesn't last more than a day." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "We might lose a day of work tomorrow if the ground stays wet." She nodded. They were quiet for a while. The storm spoke for them the way storms do, filling up the silence so it didn't need to be filled. "I got a letter today," she said, "from Emmett Hartley. The loans are cleared. The property is free for sale." He said nothing. "I also got a second offer," she said, "from a local rancher named Carl Thibodeau. His property borders ours on the western side. He wants to purchase the land to expand his own operation. His offer is slightly below Vane's, but he's a neighbor, and from what Clara Finch tells me, he's an honest man who's been here 20 years and treats his land well." Martin turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Thibodeau is a good man," he said. "He and your uncle got along well." "You know him. He brought help when I was rebuilding the barn roof," Martin said. "He's the kind of man who shows up when there's work to be done." Mabel looked at him. There was something she needed to say, and she was building up to it in the way she always built up to hard things, circling them, finding all the approaches before choosing one. "I could take Thibodeau's offer," she said. "The money would be sufficient, not as much as Vane's, but sufficient. It would clear the debts and leave me with enough to start over." "Then that might be the right choice," he said evenly. "Martin," she said, and it was the first time she had called him by his first name, and they both heard it. He looked up. "Where will you go?" she asked. "After." His expression did something complex and very quiet. "I haven't let myself think about that much," he said honestly. "You should think about it," she said. "You deserve to think about it. You deserve more than an informal arrangement that can be dissolved by a letter from a stranger." "The arrangement was what it was," he said. "I'm not complaining about it." "I know you're not," she said. "That's part of the problem." He looked at her with a sharpness that was different from his usual steadiness. "What do you mean?" She pressed both hands flat on the table. "I mean that you have given this land 4 years of your best work and your best self, and you will leave it without a legal claim to anything, and you will do it quietly and with dignity, and you will not complain because that is the kind of man you are. And I find that I'm having a great deal of difficulty with that." He stared at her. Outside, the thunder rolled over the hills. "Mabel," he said. Her name in his voice was like the first note of a song she had been hearing only in pieces until that moment. "Don't," she said, but without conviction. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I want you to understand that. I'm not asking you to give me something or to change your plans or to feel anything you don't feel. You came here to sell this land, and that is your right, and it's the sensible thing to do, and I've known it since the day you arrived." "Then stop looking at me like that," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I can't," he said simply. The storm came down around the house. The lamp on the table cast its warm circle of light. And Mabel Collins, who had built her whole adult life on practicality, and who had 17 sensible reasons to keep the wall between herself and this man, felt the wall come down all at once, not dramatically, not with a crash, but the way ice melts, quietly and inevitably, and with a kind of relief you don't expect. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, just her hand on his hand, just that. He turned his hand and held hers. His grip was warm and certain and unhurried, the grip of a man who knows how to hold something without crushing it. They stayed like that for a long time while the storm moved through, saying nothing more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said just then. The next 3 days were the days when the hidden things came out. Not in a single dramatic revelation, not in a confrontation or an accusation, but in the way that real intimacy reveals things, slowly and in pieces, like ground fog lifting to show the terrain beneath. She told him about her father. Not the simple fact of it, which she had recounted before, but the actual experience of it. How she had been 9 years old, and she had watched her father walk down the front steps of their house on a Tuesday morning with a bag she hadn't noticed him packing, and how he had turned at the bottom of the steps and looked at her watching from the upstairs window, and how he had not said anything, had just looked at her for a moment and then turned away and walked to the end of the street and around the corner and out of her life. How she had watched that corner for a week, half expecting him to come back around it. How she had eventually stopped watching. Martin listened to all of it without trying to fix it or minimize it or contextualize it into something smaller and more manageable. He simply listened with his whole attention, which was the rarest and most valuable thing any person could offer another. "That's why you don't trust plans," she said when she had finished. "Or rather, that's why I don't trust anything that can't be written down and signed and made legally binding. Because the things that aren't," he said, "can just walk away," she said. He nodded slowly. "I understand that better than you might think," he said. And then he told her about a woman he had loved on the cattle trail 7 years ago. A woman in Abilene named Rose, who had been the daughter of a boarding house owner, and who had been kind and clever, and who he had been planning to return to after the next drive, planning to make something permanent with, and who had married someone else by the time he came back, because he had been 3 months later than he'd said he'd be due to a delay in Kansas. And because she had needed something certain and he had not been certain enough. She was right to do it, he said. I was not a man who could offer her certainty then. I was still running. He paused. I've thought about that a lot since I stopped running. What I was running from and what I was running toward, and how long it took me to understand that the difference mattered. What were you running from? She asked. The same thing most men run from, he said. The fear that if they stay still long enough, they'll have to know who they are. Mabel looked at him for a long moment. And who are you? She asked softly. He met her eyes. I'm a man who stayed still long enough to find out, he said. And what I found was that I belong here. Not because it's mine on paper, because it knows me and I know it. Because I have put myself into this ground and it has put itself into me, and that is not nothing. She came to him that evening, not dramatically, not recklessly, but with the clear-eyed certainty of a woman who had examined her own heart and found something there she had not expected to find and was choosing to honor it. She came to the door of the foreman's quarters and knocked, and when he opened it she looked at him in the evening light and said, I don't want to sell this ranch. He was very still. I know that changes everything, she said. I know it's not the plan. I know I don't know how to farm, and I don't know this land, and I don't know Wyoming, and I have 17 sensible reasons not to say what I'm about to say. Say it, he said quietly. I want to stay, she said. Not to sell and go back to what I had, which was not very much. I want to stay here, and I want you to stay. She paused. With me. He crossed the threshold of the doorway without taking his eyes off her. He stood close enough that she had to tilt her head up to hold his gaze. Mabel Collins, he said, very slowly, I have been in love with you since you stood on that porch and told me to get off your land. She laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised and warm and entirely undignified, and it surprised her so much that she covered her mouth with her hand for a moment. And then he was smiling, really smiling, the full width of it, and it was the most beautiful thing she had seen on a human face in a very long time. He kissed her as the sun went down behind the western hills, and it was a kiss that felt like the conclusion of an argument that neither of them had wanted to win, because winning it would have meant losing something more important than the argument. The next 4 days were the happiest of Martin Hawkins's life, though he did not say so out loud because he was not yet a man who said things like that without careful prior consideration. But they were. The work continued, and the harvest was approaching, and there were 1,000 practical things to be addressed, but underneath all of it was the fact of her and the fact of what was between them, and it made everything else feel lit from within. They talked about what it would look like, this staying. She was practical about it. which he was grateful for, because it meant the conversation was grounded in reality rather than in the romantic haze that could turn such decisions into regret. She would need to find a way to use the skills she had, because the land alone would not support them in the early years without careful management and supplemental income. She knew accounting, she knew letters. She had been told more than once that Redfield had no school teacher, that the children in the surrounding area had no organized schooling, that parents had been petitioning the county for 2 years without result. "There it is," he said when she mentioned this. "What? What you do next?" he said. She looked at him. "Teaching in Redfield." "Teaching in Redfield," he said. "You could ride in 3 days a week or arrange boarding during the week and come home for the weekends. The county would pay a teacher's salary. It's not a large salary, but combined with what the farm produces, it's enough." She was quiet for a moment, turning it over, fitting the pieces together the way she had always fit practical pieces together. "I would need to write to the county education board," she said. "Clara Finch knows who to write to," he said. "She knows everyone." Mabel looked at the fields outside the window with a different look than she had given them on the day she arrived. Not the look of a woman assessing assets for sale. The look of a woman seeing a future laid out on the ground before her and finding it, to her own surprise, more than enough. The harvest came on the 21st day. It was everything Martin had said it would be. The weather held clear and dry after the storm, and the wheat was ready, every head full and golden, the whole field bowing slightly in the morning breeze as if it knew. Martin had made arrangements with Ed Pryor and 2 of his sons and Carl Thibodeau and his hired man to come help with the cutting and binding, which was the Wyoming way, neighbors helping neighbors because the work was too large for any single man. Mabel had made arrangements of a different kind. She had been up since before dawn making food in the quantities required to feed 7 hungry workers through a full harvest day, a thing she had never done before but approached with the same methodical competence she brought to everything. By the time Ed Pryor's wagon came up the road in the early light, there were pies cooling on the windowsill, and a pot of coffee the size of a small barrel, and enough biscuits to repaper the kitchen walls. The day was long and hard and full of noise and motion, and the particular joy of purposeful work done in good company. Mabel worked alongside the men, not at the cutting, which required skill and rhythm she didn't yet have, but carrying water and food, keeping the energy up, and working the binding section where Martin showed her how to tie the cut sheaves into bundles that could be stuck to dry. By noon she had gotten the hang of it and was working with a rhythm, and Ed Pryor's eldest son, a young man of 19 named Samuel, had told her she had the hands for it, which was apparently a high compliment. Martin worked all day with an intensity and a focus that she could not stop watching. He moved through the field with the complete confidence of a man in his rightful place, calling instructions, adjusting the work, lifting and cutting and binding, and he checked on her periodically with a glance that lasted a second but said everything she needed to hear. By evening the field was cut, and the wheat was stuck in long rows, and the golden light of the late afternoon lay over it all, and everyone was bone tired and satisfied in the way you can only be satisfied after work that means something. Ed Pryor shook Martin's hand and looked at Mabel with an honest appraisal. "Gerald always said this land was good land," he said. "Nice to see it in good hands." Mabel understood what he was offering. "Thank you," she said. "We intend to keep it that way." The wheat came out naturally without calculation, and she felt Martin's hand find the small of her back briefly, just a brush, just a moment. After everyone had gone and the evening settled over the ranch like a held breath slowly released, they sat on the porch together watching the first stars come out over the Wyoming sky. The harvest was in. The 22 days were over. The agreement had been honored. "I suppose technically," she said, "you could leave now." "Technically," he said. "Are you going to?" He turned to look at her. "What do you think?" She leaned into his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The stars came out one by one over the dark hills. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I need to tell you that I'm not easy. I'm practical to the point of being difficult sometimes, and I don't trust easily, and I've built very strong walls, and they don't come down all at once. They come down in pieces over time. And I've been hurt in ways that have left marks that won't disappear overnight. I know that, he said. And I need you to know that what I said the other night about staying, I meant it, but I also need it to be real, not a decision made in a moment of feeling, a real decision that we both make with our eyes open. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sky. Then he said, I've been making this decision every day since you got here. Not the part about you, I didn't plan that and neither did you, but the part about this place, about staying, about what I want my life to be. And every day I've made the same decision. He turned to look at her. I want to stay here. I want to build something here that lasts. And I want to build it with you, Mabel. Not because you arrived on the right day at the right time, but because of who you are. The way you read that maintenance journal and then went to find the truth in it. The way you wrote Mrs. Pryor's letter for her without being asked. The way you got in that field today and learned how to tie a sheaf at 40 attempts until you had it right. I want to be the man standing next to that woman for a very long time. She was quiet. Inside her chest, something was happening that she had no precedent for and no word for, and was choosing, for the first time in her practical life, not to analyze. All right, she said. All right, he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost laughing. All right, she said again firmly, as if she were closing a very important transaction, which in a way she was. He laughed then, a full warm sound in the dark, and she felt it in her shoulder where she leaned against him. All right then, he said. 3 months later, on a Saturday in October with the Wyoming sky a blue so deep it looked painted, Mabel Collins and Martin Hawkins were married in the church in Redfield that doubled as a town meeting hall. Clara Finch organized the reception with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for something good to happen in this town for a while. Ed and Trudy Pryor came. Carl Thibodeau brought his wife Helena and their 3 children. Samuel Pryor, who had told Mabel she had the hands for farming, stood up straight and wore his best shirt, and looked slightly in love with the whole occasion the way 19-year-old young men sometimes do in the presence of something genuinely good. The County Education Board had responded to Mabel's letter within 6 weeks with an offer of a formal teaching position, 3 days a week in a one-room schoolhouse that needed considerable repair, a detail she had forwarded to Martin, who had ridden out to assess it, and then ridden back with a list of materials he intended to acquire and fix it with before the first day of school. She had looked at that list and felt something she could now put a name to. She wore her blue dress, the one she had arrived in, cleaned and pressed and with the road dust finally gone from it, and she stood at the front of the church next to a man in a clean dark suit that Clara Finch had quietly organized because she had seen the situation coming before either of the people in it had fully understood it, and she made her vows in a voice that was steady and clear, and he made his in a voice that was very quiet and very certain. And the minister pronounced them married under the Wyoming sky, with the smell of the cottonwood trees coming through the open doors of the church. She had sold Gerald Collins's Bible to no one. She had kept it. She had found his unfinished letter still folded in the back cover, and she had made a decision about it. The night before the wedding, she had written the rest of it, not pretending to be Gerald, not falsifying anything, but simply writing what she believed he had meant to say, what she now knew to be true from every page of his maintenance journal and every neighbor who had shaken their head with fondness when his name came up. She had written that a man's worth was in what he tended and how he tended it, and that the Clearwater Ranch was testament to that in every repaired fence post and every harvested field. She had written that this was never a transaction, that it had always been about belonging, and she had signed it with her own name, not his, because it was hers to say. She had given it to Martin the morning of the wedding. He had read it standing in the kitchen in his good clothes with his hat in his hand, and when he finished he had been quiet for a long time, and then he had looked at her with eyes that were not, she noticed, entirely dry, and said, "Thank you." It needed to be finished, she said simply. The winter of 1882 was cold and quiet, and the best winter of either of their lives. The school opened in November, repaired and painted and stocked with books that Mabel had sourced from a Chicago distributor she still had contacts with. The first day of school brought 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 15, and she stood at the front of the room and looked at them and felt the return of something she had thought she had given up, the particular joy of purpose matched to person. Martin drove her to Redfield on her school days and used the time in town to conduct ranch business, and on the days she stayed home, he worked the land through the shortening days of autumn and into the cold months, and she learned to love the rhythms of it, the way the ranch had its own calendar, its own needs, its own logic. She was not a natural farmer, but she was a fast learner and a hard worker, and the land was patient with her. They talked every evening at the kitchen table about everything. About the children in her school, about the land and what it needed, about books and about the territory, and about the injustices they could name and the ones they couldn't solve alone. Martin had connections with a Arapaho man named Thomas Bear Feather who came by the ranch periodically to trade, and the conversations between Martin and Thomas had, over the years, developed into something like a real friendship, complicated and honest, and built on mutual recognition of what had happened and what was still happening to the Arapaho people in Wyoming. Mabel had sat in on several of these conversations with great attention, and she had eventually begun her own correspondence with the tribal representatives and the federal Indian Agency on behalf of a land claim dispute that Thomas had described, a claim that deserved to be made in writing and in the legal language that could actually move it forward. She could not fix the deep injustice of it, but she could write clearly and she could address a letter to the right person, and she could be one more voice saying that something wrong had been done. And that mattered, because silence was complicity, and she had enough of her own experience of being dismissed to know that being heard, even imperfectly, was not nothing. Spring came with a particular violence and beauty, the way spring comes in Wyoming, breaking over the land all at once after a hard winter. The fields were plowed and planted, and this time Mabel worked alongside Martin from the first day, not learning but doing, because she had learned enough by then to be useful in a real way. The schools had their spring recess for planting time, which was not a coincidence, and she spent the 10 days of it outside from first light, her hands in the earth that was hers and his and theirs. On the third morning of planting week, she paused in the middle of a row and was sick behind a fence post with a thoroughness that left no ambiguity. Martin was beside her immediately, a hand between her shoulder blades. "Mabel." She wiped her mouth. She stood up straight. She looked at the field in front of her and then at him. "I think," she said, "we should find out if Redfield has a doctor." Redfield had a doctor named Henry Watts, a transplanted New Englander of about 60 who had been practicing medicine on the frontier for 20 years and who had delivered more babies than he could count. He examined Mabel with clinical efficiency and confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. She was with child. She was 5 weeks along, by his estimate. She rode back to the ranch in the buckboard beside Martin, who had insisted on coming to the appointment, and who had sat in the waiting room with his hat in his hands in a state of what she suspected was barely contained emotion for the 20 minutes she was with the doctor. When she came out and told him, he had looked at her with an expression she was going to carry in her heart for the rest of her life. He said nothing for a moment. Then he took her hands in both of his and held them. "A baby," he said, as if he needed to say the word aloud to make it real. "Yes," she said. He brought her hands up and pressed them to his face, his eyes closed, and she felt his breath against her knuckles and the warmth of him, and she thought this. This is what her father had walked away from and never come back to find. This exact thing. She understood for the first time, completely and without resentment, how profound his loss had been. Not hers, his. The baby was born in November, 3 days after the first anniversary of their wedding, which felt like either remarkable coincidence or the ranch's own sense of timing. It was a boy. He came into the world on a Wednesday morning while the snow fell soft and steady outside the window, and Trudy Pryor, who had midwifed half the births in the county, kept everything calm and sure. They named him Gerald, after the man who had brought them together by dying, which was the strangest and most appropriate tribute either of them could think of. Gerald Martin Hawkins was a large and vocal infant who made his preferences known from the first hours, and who looked, in Mabel's considered opinion, exactly like his father, which Martin disputed gently on the grounds that the baby's hair appeared to be headed toward dark brown rather than his own near black, but which everyone else who saw him confirmed. The first year of Gerald's life was the year that the ranch became something neither of them had fully imagined, when they were making cautious plans in the kitchen during a storm. It became a home in the deepest sense, a place that held the specific accumulated life of the people inside it, the records of the seasons and the repairs and the books read and the conversations had, and the arguments that had been honest, and the making up that had followed, and the meals cooked, and the mornings woken to, and the slow knowledge of another person that replaces infatuation with something so much more durable. Martin went to Casper in the spring of 1884 and registered the property officially in both their names, Mabel Collins Hawkins and Martin Hawkins, co-owners of the Clearwater Ranch. The attorney Emmett Hartley, who had first written to Mabel in Chicago about the inheritance, processed the paperwork with a genuine pleasure that he said came from seeing an estate resolved in a way that produced good results rather than the more common alternatives. When Martin came home from Casper with the registered deed, he laid it on the kitchen table in front of her. She looked at it at both their names in the formal printed hand of the county records, and something settled in her that had been moving for a long time. Gerald would have been pleased, she said. He would have been insufferable about it, Martin said. He would have said he planned the whole thing. She laughed. He might have. Little Gerald, 8 months old and sitting on the kitchen floor with a wooden spoon he had claimed as his personal property, banged the spoon against the floor in what seemed like agreement. The school in Redfield had grown. By the spring of 1884, Mabel had 31 students, and the original one-room schoolhouse needed expansion. She had written to the county, and the county had been predictably slow, and so she had written directly to a school foundation in Denver and received a grant that was not large, but was enough for the timber and the labor, and Martin and Ed Pryor and Carl Thibodeau and 3 of the older students' fathers had raised the addition in a week that spring, and the school had a second room now, and there was talk of finding a second teacher so that the younger children and the older ones could be taught separately. Mabel had a candidate in mind, a young woman in Casper named Dolores Ramos, who had written to her after hearing about the Redfield school, a woman of 22 who had grown up in New Mexico Territory and who spoke both English and Spanish and had been educated at a convent school and had a passion for teaching that came through every line of her letter. Mabel had written back, and then had gone to Casper to meet her in person, and had come home and told Martin that Redfield was getting a second teacher. Martin had smiled in a particular way that suggested he was not surprised. He had learned in 2 years of marriage that when Mabel Collins Hawkins set her mind to something, the smart response was to find out what help she needed and provide it. Thomas Bear Feather came to the ranch that same spring with news about the land claim correspondence. The federal agent in Cheyenne had acknowledged the formal submission, which was progress, real progress, of a kind that had not been made before, and Thomas had come specifically to tell Mabel because the submission had been hers, and it deserved to be her news. She had sat with Thomas at the kitchen table with little Gerald on her lap making his opinions known, and she had listened to Thomas's account with the careful attention she gave everything that mattered, and at the end she had said that they would keep going, that this was not finished, and Thomas had nodded with the measured respect of a man who did not give it carelessly. Martin, who had been making coffee at the stove through this conversation, turned around with 3 cups and set them on the table and sat down, and looked at his wife and his friend and his son, and the room that contained all of them, and felt something in his chest that was so full it had no room to be articulated. He thought about the man he had been when he rode into this valley in the fall of 1878, hollowed out and moving by habit and carrying things that needed to be put down. He thought about the first morning he had turned the soil in the western field, and the way the ground had smelled, and the particular silence of the land after the noise of the trail, and how he had thought, "I could stay here." And what a radical and terrifying thought that had been for a man who had spent 7 years running. He thought about a woman stepping off a buckboard in a road-dusted navy dress with a deed in her hand, and a chin lifted at an angle that dared anyone to challenge her right to be there. And how he had thought in the same moment, both this is not what I expected, and I am in trouble. He thought about a kitchen table and a storm and a hand laid over his in the lamplight. He had put himself into this ground, and the ground had put itself into him. But he had not, when he arrived, understood that the ground was just the beginning. That staying still long enough to know yourself was only the first thing. That the next thing, the necessary thing, was finding someone to know you too. The summer of 1885 brought changes. The wheat harvest that year was the best in the ranch's recorded history, the fields having been expanded on the north side, with the purchase of an adjacent parcel that Martin had negotiated carefully over the winter. The cattle operation had grown to a modest but sustainable size, 18 head, managed with the help of a young man named Alejandro Cruz, who had come up from New Mexico with Dolores Ramos, and who was looking for steady work and a chance to be somewhere that treated him fairly. Alejandro was 23, quiet and exceptionally competent, and he and Dolores Ramos were, by the summer of 1885, conducting a courtship so careful and so proper that it had become a source of gentle amusement to everyone in the surrounding county except the 2 of them, who were too absorbed in the courtship itself to notice the amusement. "You should say something to him," Mabel told Martin, on the subject of Alejandro. "He doesn't need me to tell him anything," Martin said. "He's young and he's cautious, and he has no family nearby to push him along," Mabel said. "A word from a man he respects would not go amiss." Martin thought about it. Then he thought about himself at 23, on the cattle trail, running and telling himself it was freedom. "All right," he said. He did not report to Mabel what he said to Alejandro. But 2 months later, Alejandro came to the Clearwater Ranch with his hat in his hands and asked Martin formally if he could ask Dolores Ramos to marry him. And Martin had said yes with a simplicity and a warmth that had meant something to the young man. Mabel could see it in his face. Dolores and Alejandro were married in the Redfield Church on a Saturday in October of 1885, and the parallels to the previous October wedding in that same church 3 years before were not lost on anyone present, and Clara Finch organized the reception with the same efficient joy as before, though she claimed she had expected this one even longer than the first. Little Gerald Hawkins turned 3 in November of 1885, and was a child of absolute conviction who wanted to be outside at all times, and had his father's hands and his mother's eyes, and the particular fearlessness that belongs to children who have been well loved by people who are not afraid. In the early spring of 1886, Mabel told Martin she was expecting again. He sat down at the kitchen table when she told him. He sat down with the particular purposefulness of a man who wants to be fully present and upright for important things, but who also needs in this moment the support of a chair. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "Good," he said. Then almost immediately, "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "Dr. Watts says everything is as it should be." He reached across the table and took her hand, the same table, the same 2 chairs, the same Wyoming sky and the window that had been witness to so many of the things they had said and decided and become. "Gerald's going to have opinions about this," he said. "Gerald has opinions about everything," she said. "He gets that from both of us." Martin laughed and she laughed, and outside the window the spring was pushing up through the last of the snow along the south-facing creek bank, the earliest green of the year, the color that meant the worst was over. The second child was a girl, born in September of 1886. They named her Ruth, after Martin's mother, and she came into the world with her mother's dark hair, and a composure that the midwife said was exceptional in a newborn. Gerald, who was nearly 4, received his sister with a solemnity that made both his parents struggle not to laugh, presenting her with a flat river stone he had selected from the creek bank with great deliberation, which he placed in her basket as if it were a gift of considerable significance, which to him it was. Ruth Collins Hawkins grew up knowing from the beginning what she was, the daughter of this land and these people and this history. The granddaughter of a woman who had held a household together with ferocious quiet dignity, and of a man who had turned soil on the Wyoming frontier and built something real. By the fall of 1887, the Clearwater Ranch was prosperous in the modest, durable way that means something has been built to last. The wheat fields were known in the county for their quality. The cattle were healthy. The school had 38 students and 2 teachers, and a second edition planned for the following spring. The letters to the Federal Land Agency had resulted in a partial recognition of the Arapaho land claim, not the full resolution, which was still years away and would require more voices and more time than any single letter could accomplish, but a real recognition, a legal acknowledgement that something had been done that needed accounting. Mabel Collins Hawkins sat at her kitchen table on an October evening, the children asleep in their beds, the lamp burning its steady circle of light, and wrote a letter to the County Education Board proposing the establishment of a formal school district, with 3 schools across the county and a superintendent position, which she was suggesting for Dolores Ramos, who had grown into an educator of exceptional skill and whose understanding of the county's children, including those who came from Spanish-speaking households and those from the surrounding native communities, was exactly the kind of understanding a school district superintendent needed. She wrote the letter in the clear, direct hand she had always had, and when she finished, she left it on the table for the morning post and blew out the lamp and went down the hall. Martin was not yet asleep. He was lying in the dark with his hands behind his head, which was his habitual position when he was thinking, a habit she had learned to read the way she had learned to read everything about him over 5 years of marriage, the 1,000 small fluencies of a shared life. "You're still awake," she said, settling beside him. "I was thinking about the north fence," he said. "There's a section that needs attention before the first hard freeze." "I'll add it to the list," she said. "You keep a list now," he said with genuine amusement because it was very like her and they both knew it. "I keep 17 lists," she said. "You know this." He turned onto his side to face her in the dark, and she could feel the warmth of him and hear the familiar rhythm of his breathing, and outside the window was the Wyoming night, vast and full of stars, the same sky that had been over this land long before either of them arrived, and would be over it long after, indifferent to human plans in the way that all great and permanent things are indifferent to human plans while somehow also containing all of them. "Mabel," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm glad you came to sell the ranch." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I'm glad you were here when I did." She reached for his hand in the dark and found it immediately, because she always found it immediately now, the way you find something you have learned so well that the knowledge lives in your hands rather than your head. "We should sleep," she said. "Gerald will be awake before the light." "He will," Martin agreed. "He is relentless." "He gets that from you," she said. "You've been saying that for 3 years. It keeps being true." He pulled her close, and the night settled over the Clearwater Ranch, over the repaired fences and the harvested fields and the sleeping children, and the creek running clear and cold in the dark, and the horses in the well-kept barn, and the schoolhouse in Redfield with its 2 rooms and its 38 children, and the long road that connected all of it to the larger world that was changing fast and hard, and sometimes cruelty and sometimes wonder. In the morning, Martin would mend the north fence. Mabel would post her letter. Gerald would come crashing into their room before the sun fully cleared the hills, demanding breakfast and the day, and Ruth would wake in her crib and look up at whoever came to her with the grave composure she had been born with, and the absolute confidence of a child who has never had a reason to doubt. And in that morning, as in all the mornings before it and all the mornings that would come after, the Clearwater Ranch would be exactly what it had always had the potential to be. A place made by two people who had found each other at the exact moment when the finding mattered most, who had built something out of an inheritance and a verbal agreement, and a storm and a hand laid over another hand in lamplight, who had stayed when staying was the harder and the truer and the necessary choice. The wheat fields ran long and golden to the west, and the creek ran clear and cold to the south, and the sky over Wyoming was the same blue it had always been, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.